Founders and banks can leave the same meeting with completely different takeaways because they're running on different clocks. Now, founders measure time in runway, payroll, and board pressure, while banks measure it in governance resilience, governance, and trust. Now, neither is wrong, but that gap explains why so many enterprise tech deals succeed or fail. Now, to unpack this, let's bring in someone who sits on both sides of that table. Is Mr. Michael O'Loughlin, managing partner at Argonautic Global and the U.S. ambassador of the MENA Fintech Association. Mike, thanks so much for joining us again.
Great to be back. Good morning.
Well, Mike, last week we argued that banks don't have an innovation shortage, but why do so many fintech bank relationships still struggle?
That's a great question. And to answer, I don't actually think it's because either side is doing anything wrong, so to speak. I think they're often leaving the exact same meeting with completely different expectations. Now, the founder, in my experience, walks out thinking, we found a new customer. This is fantastic. While the bank is thinking, well, that's interesting. Let's investigate it a little bit more. We've learned a lot today. Now, they sound similar, but they're completely different stages of the journey. So while founders seem to think, in terms of sales pipelines and revenue, which they need to focus on, larger institutions, for example, banks, they're more focused on the day-to-day, the operational resilience, the procurement side of things, cybersecurity, regulatory expectations, and whether this technology that this startup has just presented, whether this can actually be supported 5 years from now, will it be needed? So they're not having different conversations, but they're definitely interpreting the same conversation through different lenses. So really, the demo, that piece at the beginning, if it's the start of the
Michael,
conversation.
a really interesting question right now, because I think this is what everyone wants to know, is what exactly creates that disconnect? Because there's clearly a disconnect when everyone goes into that meeting, they have the same meeting, but then they walk away with two completely different viewpoints. So what creates the disconnect?
It's a great question, and that disconnect is very real. I think it comes down to something that we don't really talk enough about, which is time. Time has completely different value depending on which side of the table you're sitting on. So as a founder, you might only have 18 months of runway, cash burn rate, very real. Every month represents payroll, investors pressure, board pressure, expectations. When are we going to get that return on the investment? Meanwhile, the banks, they're completely different, meaning they're thinking about customer deposits, that operational resilience piece I touched upon. So when founders get in front of banks and they think banks are moving too slowly, banks think founders are moving too quickly. So they're really looking through that different lens again, and they're simply operating on different clocks. So technology moves, at the speed of code, and institutions, well, they move at the speed of trust. And that's something we need to discuss.
So I think when we're talking about speed, a lot of people want to know like why banks don't move quickly. So is the question here, are banks simply working or moving way too slow compared to what founders are moving?
Having been on the bank side as well, I will say I don't think that's necessarily a fair criticism of the banks. Because what are banks? They're designed to be they're not designed really to be the fastest organization in an economy, and for good reason. They're designed to be the most trusted. If a social media company, for example, gets something wrong, it's embarrassing. But if a bank gets something wrong, that can have a knock-on effect that can impact the markets, financial stability, economies, jobs, etc. So caution isn't really, I would say, evidence of failure. In many respects, caution is part of a product customers that they're buying. They're buying into that. So I would say overall, banks aren't necessarily paid to innovate first, they're paid to protect first.
So, Mike, this is the question I think that everyone wants answers to, because this is probably going to make people a lot of money. What should founders do differently when they're in this process?
I take my hat off to founders, first of all. I think the biggest mistake I do see founders spending months perfecting the product, in the room with no windows, but not necessarily spending enough time understanding the institution they're trying to sell into. So there are different areas within a bank, for example. So technology is only part of an enterprise sale. So I would really focus on who owns the budget, who signs off from procurement. Know this before you walk in the door. Who carries the operational risk? And really, whose life are you making easier as a result of this institution potentially purchasing your product? And those questions often, take time and preparation, but they're more important than just showcasing another product feature. I always encourage founders to pause, take a moment and say, stop saying, how can I sell software? And instead ask themselves, well, whose problem inside this organization am I genuinely solving? Because really, at the end of the day, if you're a startup, you're not selling software, you're selling organizational change.
Well, so Mike, in the perspective of trying to build a stronger partnership with the bank, from the investor standpoint, has that changed your perspective? And how do you actually build a stronger partnership with the bank?
Has it changed my perspective? Sure, completely. It's probably made me more sympathetic to both sides. I never thought I'd say that, but I do understand, founders who are watching the runway getting shorter every month, as I said earlier. I also understand an executive who's thinking, if this goes wrong, I'm accountable. And every day, costs somebody something. So the founder loses runway, as I said, the bank loses time, and the customer loses the benefits of that innovation arriving sooner or in some cases later. So banks spend time, founders spend runway, and sooner or later they're going to collide.
Awesome. Well, Mike, thank you so much for joining us on Capital Markets. It's always interesting to get your point of view because you've been on both sides of the equation. So thank you so much for joining us and for giving your advice on how to kind of make sure things go to the next level. Thanks so much, Mike.
Thank you very much.